Welcome to Rosie the Reviewer. We're your hosts. I'm Sam,
And I'm Marcia.
and we like World War II media, and we want to talk about it. Welcome back to Rosie the Reviewer. We are at long last starting our series on the Pacific, which is a mini-series that came out in 2010. It was created by Bruce McKenna and executive produced by Tom Hanks, Steven Spielberg, and Gary Gatesman. It's part of the HBO War World War II collection, along with Band of Brothers and Masters of the Air. And we do have episodes on those if you guys want to go check those out. The Pacific follows the United States Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater of Operations during World War II, focused specifically on the wartime service of three real Marines. They are Robert Leckie, Eugene Sledge, and John Basilone. Robert Leckie and Eugene Sledge wrote memoirs after the war, Helmet for My Pillow and With the Old Breed at Peleliu and Okinawa, respectively, upon which much of the action is based. It also pulls from several other sources, including Red Blood, Black Sand, the memoir of Chuck Tatum, who was trained by and fought with John Basilone at Iwo Jima. It's available wherever you can access HBO, which is on Crave in Canada. And we are joined today by our guest, Beck, who was last with us on our Laugh a Minute Fury episode and who is a big Robert Leckie head. So welcome back, Beck.
Hi, thank you. So glad that my standing for a deceased white guy is what's really distinguishing me in the world. He is great, though. I love him.
Let's talk about our general impressions. Mart, how do you feel about the Pacific?
My stance on the Pacific has changed throughout the years, and it's my favorite out of the three. It used to be Band of Brothers, but the Pacific just has a more almost critical view of the war, and I like how gritty it is. It's also at the same time my least favorite thing about it is how gritty it is, so it's like double-edged sword, I guess. But I really like the music in this as well, and I love the acting. I remember when I first watched it, it was kind of a guilty pleasure watch because I was watching everything that Joe Mazzello was in. But now Eugene Sledge, as much as I like him, is not my favorite character anymore, so I've moved on to other things. I don't know, the acting is great. I like all the storylines now. I never used to, but I do now. And yeah, it's good. I like it. How about you, Beck?
So it's also my favorite. I think it has been my favorite. I am about to confess some deep World War II history nerd shame and say that I actually didn't even finish Masters of the Air because it didn't hold my attention well enough. I love Band of Brothers too, but for me also it was the slightly more critical eye, or like the less rah-rah America eye of it, because Band of Brothers gets pretty real in some moments, but I don't think it got as real as it got real about what like the enemies were doing and the way it was affecting the men, but it didn't get as real about what the men were doing and things of that nature as well, which I think Pacific did a better job at. I do think the Pacific is a little scattered in its approach to narrative because it was pulling from so many sources. But having said that, it will always hold a special place in my heart because I don't know, I just adore it. I hadn't seen anything like it when I first saw it, and I think it still holds up even 15 years later. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I saw this maybe a couple years after it came out. So it's the first HBO War property that I saw. And there's definitely fair criticism about, like you were saying, the sort of three at times disjointed narratives don't fit together that well. And there's places where I think the first time I saw it, I found it a little bit hard to follow potentially. But that said, every time I watch it, I find more and more things that really interest me about it, that make me want to delve into it a little further. I think that the books that it's based on are extraordinary, and they did a pretty reasonable job of bringing those to life and transitioning those to television. And yeah, it really is the post 9/11 war show. It's a little bit more reflective of people feeling a bit more jaded and perhaps a bit more willing to be critical of US foreign policy and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I really enjoy it. I don't know if it's the easiest watch for someone who's only perhaps casually into war media. I think maybe Band of Brothers is more accessible, but I love it, man. Like, it's definitely my favorite of the three.
Yeah, it's a hard watch and a hard sell even to a lot of my friends that are in the World War II space, because they're like, it's so sad. And I'm like, yeah, it was not a good time for a lot of people. Anyway.
I just want to quickly note that there is more to enjoy if you enjoy With the Old Breed. Eugene Sledge's son, Henry Sledge, has added to the book from some of his dad's work. So there's more to read if we ever want to get into that.
I will definitely be looking that up. I went and looked up this. I'm going to sound like such a creep. I looked up Eugene Sledge's papers from when he was writing about nematodes at school, and I read his papers about nematodes because I was like, I love an academic paper and I want to see how he thought, you know what I mean?
I want to know what nematodes are. I don't know what those are.
They're like microscopic little, I don't even remember the specific classification because this was a couple years ago and I haven't read a ton about them since. Maybe not quite microscopic, but they're teeny tiny and they live in soil, especially like wet soil. And a lot of times they'll cause problems for trees and ecology and things like of that nature. So being that he was like a guy living in kind of a southern marshy area and I live in a southern marshy area, I was like, we probably have some interests in common. I like weird little bugs.
Lovely. With that said, I guess let's get into the plot of episode 1.
Yeah, so the Pacific does a thing similar to Band of Brothers where they have a sort of collection of interviews with veterans at the beginning. I think Sidney Phillips is on there, R.V. Bergen, a couple of other people. And you also get some clips of what was happening and like a little Tom Hanks voiceover. So we get this little introductory segment like that. And then we get the opening theme, which is beautiful. It's a song called Honor by Hans Zimmer, Jeff Zanelli, and Blake Neely. And it's just gorgeous. I never skip it. No matter how many times I watch The Pacific, I always watch the opening.
Can I just say, I don't get those. I've seen them before, but I don't get the interviews or the Tom Hanks opening. So I'm in the dark.
I think it depends on which version you're watching, because I remember the first time I watched it, those were not on there. But now every time I watch it, they're always on there. So I don't know if they release like an updated version or something.
I know I've seen it. I've seen it on either HBO or Netflix, or even, they're probably on my DVD, but when I was watching on Netflix today, they weren't on there, and then I watched on HBO because I was missing them, and they're also not on HBO for me. So it's really annoying.
That's
because
weird.
I missed them.
Like if it's like a licensing thing.
That's so weird.
Yeah.
Sid Phillips, I will say, real life Sid Phillips has like the sweetest face. He just looks like a happy guy. You know what I mean?
Oh my God. And can I also say, so last year I went to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. And I was just walking through the Pacific section, and all of a sudden I heard someone talking about Guadalcanal, and my ears just perked up, and I was like, Sidney Phillips is talking. And I like went around looking, and like sure enough, they had a recording of him speaking and like some pictures of him and like a little display and stuff. And I was like, wow, really fucking weird that I just recognized that old man's voice.
It does feel weird sometimes. That's a great museum, though. I need to get back there. I haven't been in like 5 or 6 years, and I want to see what updates they've made since then.
I got to go again. I dragged my dad and my uncle and my mom down there. We all went, and I mean, they actually had, I think, a surprisingly for them good time because none of them are like super into World War II. But we spent maybe 4 hours. But I'm like, you could spend several days. Like, there's tons of stuff.
Oh yeah.
One last thing about the opening of the show: out of all the theme songs from all the 3 HBO War things, this is it for me. I can put this on at night and just cry. It's just amazing.
Yeah, it's my favorite. And I want to say, respect where respect is due. All the openings for all the shows go absolutely hard, but this one is my favorite. I listen to the song outside of watching the show. I always watch the credits. I don't ever skip them. Like, they're just, I don't know. It's just the best.
When the actual show starts, we meet Robert Leckie, played by James Badge Dale, and he's a young journalist from New Jersey who has enlisted in the Marine Corps. But before he ships out, he briefly encounters his neighbor, Vera Keller, played by Caroline Laverna, and he says, maybe I'll write to you. And she's like, all right, and it'll be relevant later. I think this encounter is so sweet. He's just come from church and she's just going in there. They're just the cutest 2 people on the planet for me.
Whoever came up with this whole making the letters to Vera such a crucial pivot point in Leckie's storyline, like kudos. It's absolutely amazing. Just throughout the whole show, the voiceover, Dear Vera, XYZ is happening. And then the reveal at the end when he's talking to her about the letters, like just chef's kiss. It's so good.
I love it.
Yeah. It's also like a much sweeter introduction to who Leckie is than how he opens his book. I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but it's a time. And I do really like that they use that as kind of the thread of memory of this home, this idealized version of home that they're like thinking about while they're gone.
For sure.
I was gonna say about Leckie, and maybe in general about relationships with parents in this show, is that Leckie's relationships with his dad as he ships out is so sad. It's the saddest scene to watch because they really stay with that moment for quite a long time as he's getting ready to get on the bus, I think. Is it a bus or a train? I don't remember. And his dad is just distracted and he doesn't really say goodbye to him. And then it's kind of this detached way of saying goodbye, or nothing like good luck or I hope you come home or anything like that. And it's so different between the three sort of families we see. I like that we get to see the families a lot in this show. If you compare it to Band of Brothers, you don't see any of them. So I do like it.
If I'm going to be like emotionally affected by like a character death or character trauma in a show, like usually it's because of the impact that it has on the people who are left behind. Like particularly, I think in Basilone's case, it's very effective the way they do that. And like with Leckie, we see him come home from the war and his mom's like, why didn't you tell me you were coming? I didn't have time to clean your room. Like it's very, and he talks about it at one point, how he's the youngest of 10. And obviously he grew up in the Depression and things were a little tough and his parents were tired by the time he came along. And it's just like really informs who he is as someone who is kind of upfront, pretty sarcastic and witty and little, bucking against authority and tough and that kind of stuff. But he also has this vulnerability. Like he also seems like quite a lonely person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think part of why I like the Pacific more than Band of Brothers, which I adore, is because you spend so much time with the people. Like you get to see how the war is affecting more groups of people than just the soldiers. And I guess you get a little of that in Masters of the Air too. Again, I didn't finish that one, so I can't really speak on it. But like, I don't know. I just really appreciate how they made it feel more like it wasn't this thing that was happening to these guys away. It was this thing that was interrupting everyone's lives everywhere.
Yeah. So we also get introduced to Eugene Sledge, played by Joe Mazzello. He's a teenager in Mobile, Alabama. Like, can't stress enough the fact that these people are very young. And he can't enlist because he has a heart murmur. So his best friend, Sidney Phillips, played by Ashton Holmes, goes without him. And yeah, so his and Leckie's plotline ties together because Sid ends up being sort of in the same unit and friends with Robert Leckie. So we encounter Sid again with Leckie and their friends Wilbur Runner Conley, played by Keith Nobbs, Lou Chuckler Jurgens, played by Josh Hellman, and Bill Hoosier Smith, played by Jacob Pitts, as they're on a ship and they're in the Pacific and they're preparing to disembark at Guadalcanal in August of 1942. And the Marines encounter the Japanese in force for the first time at the Tenarue River.
Worth mentioning, too, for anyone who does decide to read Helmet for My Pillow, which if you're only ever going to read one more book, that's the one that I would recommend reading. But Leckie does refer to everyone by these nicknames all the time. Like he never actually says my friend Bill, who we called Hoosier. It's just Hoosier or the Hoosier, etc. So I really like that it was such an interesting personal choice in terms of the way that he saw these people. And I love that they carried that into the series, too, and like gave them that same identity there.
For sure. And so many of the nicknames are so evocative, I mean, as the officer that he calls Spearmint or whatever, it's like all these names. It's really, you're like, okay, this is a pretty succinct way of telling us what this person is like. Mm-hmm. I think I want to say one of the other books that I read by him was Turning Point for the Pacific. And I think it's that one that he dedicates to Chuckler, Runner, and Hoosier, which I thought was kind of lovely.
I remember when I first watched it, I couldn't keep Runner and Hoosier apart. I don't know why, because they're so different. I just could not remember which face went with which nickname, because they're always like almost all of them are always together. So it's like, wait, who's talking? Who are they talking about? But I know now, obviously. I know mostly because of Jacob Pitts, to be honest.
Yeah. That's why I'm a big, of course, I'm fucking forgetting what it's called now with Timothy Oliphant.
Justified.
I'm a big Justified fan. So I was like, hey, Jacob Pitts.
Well, and apparently Hoosier was almost kind of like a prototype for the Tim Gutterson character. Like some producer saw Jacob Pitts in the Pacific and was like, we need that guy.
Isn't it the same producer?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, and I'm so fond of H Company, which is like Leckie's little group of friends. And I think part of that is because Leckie was so fond of them, and you get that in his book. Like his book is really a lot less about like strategy and tactics, and this is what the Marines were doing, and a lot more about here's what me and my fuck up friends were doing.
Yeah.
Sam, can you give us some historical background, please?
The US forces landed on Guadalcanal and nearby islands in order to prevent the Japanese from using them as air bases. So at this point, there's all these little islands that no more than 12 people have ever lived on, basically in the Pacific, places that you've never heard of, places that nobody would bother fighting over, but now they're very important strategic territory. And so they're landing there, and they're also trying to support the Allied campaign to isolate the major Japanese air base at Rabaul, which is on New Britain, on the other end of the island from Cape Gloucester, which we'll see later because Leckie and his buddies will also land on Cape Gloucester and fight a battle there. The initial landing on Guadalcanal was successful, but the Japanese Navy counterattacked and succeeded in isolating the Americans on the island. So the Americans completed construction of an airfield, which is Henderson Field, and they did have to rebuild it time and time again because it got bombed quite often. And then they dug in to protect it. And so the first time they encountered the Japanese sort of in force at the Tenero River, they call it Alligator Creek, and we see this in the show. This was the first major Japanese land offensive on the Guadalcanal campaign, August 21st, 1942. And the end result is that it taught the Japanese that they had seriously underestimated American numbers, and they subsequently sent much larger forces to try and retake Henderson Airfield in the future. And the Marines were under the overall general command of U.S. Major General Alexander Vandegrift, who will actually make an appearance later in the show. He's the one who lets John Basilone re-up his enlistment. And he said after Alligator Creek, "I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting. These people refuse to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade," which, of course, we also see in the show.
I quite like how the disillusionment in the show begins immediately. Like, it comes later for a character like Sledge, but for Leckie and his crew, it's just instant. You see it in episode 1. It's like, oh wait, this is not how we expected it to be.
Yeah, that's one of the things I appreciate about Leckie as a writer, specifically in the Pacific conflict, because he, in his books, he talks about the Japanese forces as though they're enemies, but he never talks about them in the way that some authors have done. He very clearly still sees them as people. He sees them as people who are dangerous and who are like a threat to him and his friends and their safety. But he recognizes that they're in a similar situation to where the Americans are in some ways, but which I don't find is always the case. And so that was really refreshing when reading his book to be like, oh, this is a person who recognized that some of the attitudes that the people around him had about these people, that there were layers happening that wasn't just because of the war. You know what I mean? That, I don't know. It was just really nice to see in the year of our Lord, the 2010s or whatever it was that I read that book, 2016, something like that.
Yeah, because there certainly was a racial undertone to a lot of the things that happened in the Pacific that simply was absent in, the European theater where the Americans were fighting people who looked quite a lot like them.
And you see it right away on the boat, on the ship before they disembark. The CEO, I don't know who he is, but he's so vile in his description of the Japanese. And I feel like a lot of people would have taken that to be truth. Like, they also felt that way, and it's nice to see that Leckie didn't put that in any of his books. I don't know if he ever felt like that. Maybe he did, but he at least didn't put it in writing.
I think it's like a choice too, because the guy who's on the ship, who's being so gross about Japanese people generally, in the next couple of scenes, we see him cowering in a foxhole, and he gets relieved of his command because he's like simply not good at his job. And he really did not perceive the Japanese as a threat. He perceived them as like this caricature, and it came back to bite him in the ass.
Good point, actually. I kind of forgot they were the same person.
Yes. Yeah.
And in this section too, there's a part where there's one Japanese soldier left, and the Americans are taking pot shots at him, but more to tease him than anything. They just keep grazing him, and he's getting like more and more upset. And so Leckie sort of mercy kills him. And I love that because it's the first time we sort of see Leckie do something like that, but it won't be the last. There's another part where he stops his buddies from killing some farmers' cows. There's another part where, you know, when he meets Stella in Australia, he's like sitting with her mother in the garden and they're having this whole like heart to heart. You know, there's a part at the end where he's trying to get the corpsman for his friend and he can't, and he feels so much guilt about it. And I really think that we get so many really great character moments for Leckie, and just by the general way he behaves, you might be tempted to think he's like this rough around the edges, sarcastic, fast talking kind of guy, but he really does have these really brilliant, beautiful moments of trying to do the right thing.
Yeah. It's very clear from, like, to your point that his book is mostly about like his stories with him and his fuck up friends. And it is very clear that they cared about each other. Like that these were guys that were like trying their best to get each other home alive, and like a lot of people say that, but I feel like you really feel that connection with the Pacific in a lot of ways that are more real than some of the other shows that I've watched.
Yeah, for sure.
I think also, I can't remember, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. There's an episode in this show, I'm pretty sure it's Leckie that does it, where they're like looking through the packs of the soldiers that have died and he finds like a photo, like a family photo. And he has this moment of like, oh shit, like this is a guy who's got family at home that he's thinking about the same way that I'm thinking about my family at home.
It belongs to the soldier he mercy kills.
Yes. Okay. I was like, I couldn't remember I was pretty sure it was Alligator Creek, but I couldn't remember. But yeah, it's just this really stark moment. Sad, but not, you know what I mean? Like just a good bittersweet. Anyway.
Yeah.
On the third part of our sort of 3 window in this episode, we meet Sergeant John Lessalone, played by John Cena, and his friends, Sergeant Manny Rodriguez, played by John Bernthal, and Sergeant J.P. Morgan, played by Joshua Bitton. And they have dinner at Lessalone's family home. Before shipping out, that's another one of those moments that I really appreciate, because you get to see what they're like outside of the war, or before the war even. And they briefly cross paths with our first Marines, which is Leckie's crew at the end, on Guadalcanal. And it's the only time Lessalone intersects with the other 2 plotlines. And we don't know if they've met in real life. Probably not. But it's a smart way of keeping the storylines connected.
Yeah, Leckie doesn't mention him in his memoir, but it's possible that they cross paths, I guess. Basilone's father is this sweet little old man who barely speaks. He has a couple lines of dialogue. He only speaks Italian. But I think his strongest moments are they're sitting at the table and John and his dad have this moment of like eye contact. And I think like one of them puts the hand over the other's hand or something like that. And it's just really heartfelt. Like you can tell that they might live in a family where it's like hard for men to share their feelings, but you can tell that his dad really like cares about him and is worried about him. And then at the end of the show, the scene with Lena where she's bringing the medal home, and then you just see the dad's face when he gets the medal. And I'm like, oh, yeah. That little old man is doing so much emotional heavy lifting in this show. Like the scenes to me that were the most impactful, honestly, like were the scenes with Basilone and his dad.
Yeah, hard agree. And I realized the thing that I was going to say, I was thinking about episode 2, so I'm going to keep that to myself for now.
Episode 2, John Basilone and his buddies, they're on Guadalcanal at this point. They have their first bloody encounter with the Japanese in the jungle. They are led by Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, played by William Sadler, who's almost a mythic figure in the Marine Corps. He had a very long career. He's quite well known. Anyway, he tells his men that the Japanese viewed them as, quote, not ordinary troops, but a special force recruited from jails and insane asylums full of bloodlust. So I always love that because it's like, yeah, here's how we're going to motivate these guys. We're going to make them think that, the Japanese really think they're not to be fucked with, sort of thing.
Yeah. True killers.
The Marines, to me, I mean, apart from the Pacific, I haven't seen many things about the Marines. So this is all I know about the Marines, and I have to say they are kind of a different kind of breed from the Army and from the Air Force. They're different kind of fighters too, but also different characters.
Well, they certainly think so. I love the bit at the end where Leckie's going in to get his job and his boss is like, oh, I have so much respect for soldiers. And he's like, I was a Marine.
Yeah. Excuse you, sir.
How dare you?
Yeah.
I do feel like these days there are some stereotypes about Marines. Crayon eaters.
I would definitely agree with that. But I also think that that's the kind of like, I don't mean this as like in a bad way, but there's like a certain amount of us versus them that has to happen, you know what I mean, in a situation like a war zone for a unit to be effective, essentially, you know? And it's so interesting to me because it works in every branch, but like the Marines are definitely, I think, at least the Marines that I have personally known have been the loudest about it for sure, about like their specific brotherhood and stuff like that.
Leckie is writing a letter to Vera, and he says that he'll tell her the truth, quote unquote. The jungle is swallowing us, and there's 5,000 Japanese soldiers who want to kill us. So he's honest in his letters to Vera. And there's a brief bit of levity when everyone raids their army supplies. I love this scene so much. Like, there's an air raid warning because the Japanese are going to bomb the airfield, but the army doesn't know that they're not also bombing the beach. So the Marines who've been there for a while know this, and they just steal everything they can get their hands on. And First Lieutenant Hugh Corrigan, played by Henry Nixon, gives Leckie and co his smokes after that, which doesn't bode well. He gives them his Lucky Strikes instead of the Raleighs, which are apparently dead cigarettes.
Yeah,
It's like, oh, we must really be screwed.
Yeah.
This is also where Leckie steals his favorite pair of shoes.
I love that scene just in general. It does such a good job of conveying the kind of shenanigans. Like, these are boys. These are young men. You know, these are teenagers. These are guys in their early 20s for the most part, if even that, you know what I mean? Like, not many of the ones who are down here in the foxholes are any older than like maybe 24. And it just is such a great, like, well, that's a bunch of kids. That's a bunch of kids doing kid shit, you know? I mean, like, it's like, oh yeah, they were over here doing this insane thing, this unbelievable thing that a lot of people didn't survive doing. And like, they still have that part of them that is like mischievous and, you know, wants to get up to good trouble, as they call it. You know what I mean?
In the previous episode, I think Sid has his 18th birthday. So he was 17 when he landed on Guadalcanal, and then Hoosier hands him a grenade and is like, happy birthday. Like,
I love it.
yeah. I do love Leckie being a shithead so much because it's like, in no other context than World War II would this man have joined any type of military service because he can't take direction for shit. And like,
yeah. There's this bit I love from the book that's before they even get deployed, that they are in a bar and they get cut off, so they decide to steal a case of beer. It's just such a like troublemaker move. It's not the way that the Marines or any soldiers of any kind are like usually depicted in the American consciousness. And it's such an interesting take to be like, oh, this guy reminds me of my brother. And then that makes me think about like my brother dealing with stuff like this. And I don't think he would have made it, if I'm being totally honest. But, you know, it's just, I don't know. It reminds me of me in high school a little bit too. And I'm like, it really makes you feel, I think, a little closer to these characters in a way.
For sure, yeah. At this point, the Marines, I mean, part of the reason why they raid the army supplies so enthusiastically is that for quite a long time they were cut off. So they weren't getting new food in. They, notably, I think Corrigan mentions that they don't have any toilet paper. You know, they're not getting pretty much any supplies in, and they're really overstretched, and they don't have a lot of backup coming either. So when the Japanese attack, the Marine lines are very thin, and this is where we get John Basilone doing his Medal of Honor shit. And so during the Battle of Henderson Field on October 24th, 1942, Basilone was in command of 2 sections of machine guns. After 2 days, he only had 3 Marines remaining under his command. And so he sort of made do. He risked his life to obtain more ammunition for his guys. He went out into the open and cleared a field of vision for them by moving some bodies out of the way. He was running around just carrying his machine gun, like repairing it on the go, firing it. He got these massive burns on his hands and arms because the barrel gets really hot and he didn't have his glove. At one point, he held Japanese attackers at bay with a pistol and a machete. So he's doing lots of hero shit. Super unfortunately for us, they don't light this scene very well. So it's really hard to tell what's going on. But yeah, so he does big hero shit. And unfortunately, his friend Manny, who's been made a runner, who's, you know, running ammunition back and forth, etc., he dies during the battle.
They don't light any scene well in the show. It's my biggest gripe with this show is that everything is in the dark. I always wonder if it's done on purpose to give you the same sense that they would have had or something, but it's just really annoying if it's going to be on your TV.
Yeah, that's like a really generous view of what they may have been after. but I'll take it. I'll fold that into my narrative of it. I thought Basileon was interesting, but I didn't really connect with him as much as some of the other characters at first, until actually I went to the National World War II Museum, and they have a lot of information on him in certain parts of it, because there's like a place where you can look up basically every soldier who had whatever type of medal and stuff like that. And like, after learning more about him and reading part of Red Blood, Black Sand and stuff like that, I was like, oh, okay, this guy was more interesting than I maybe thought that he was in this moment. And maybe part of that was because it was like so poorly lit that I was just like, okay, he's just running around in the dark, doing whatever. His storyline for me, I think, is the most, if I had my way in the world, they would have done a solo series or movie or something just about Basileon, and they would have built the Pacific off of Leckie and Sledge's stories, because they followed each other a little more closely, I think. You know what I mean? I feel like we could have explored John Basileon a little bit more in this, because he was really an incredible person who I don't think got as much screen time as maybe the story deserved.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think, unfortunately, what hurts his storyline a little too is that sometimes Hanks and Spielberg can't resist this thing where this like sort of nostalgia kick thing about World War II, where they're like, this guy was a hero. And he's almost like Tom Hanks's like wet dream idea of an American hero. And they sort of treat him like that in some ways. And I'm like, that kind of hurts his story, because I do think real Basileon was a lot more interesting than this sort of like almost like bland in some places character that we sometimes get. And I don't know. It would have been nice to get a little more sort of color from his storyline. But I've watched the Pacific a few times, and having rewatched it a few times, like I do pick up things here and there where I'm like, okay, this is much more interesting now than I initially perceived it to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think he gets, to your point, like scrubbed a little bit in a way that some of the other characters don't, because probably of that exact thing where it's like, oh, which I think maybe is why I bounced off of it at first too, because I was like, okay, yeah, another like hero guy. But then like he was a hero. He did some incredible, absolutely unhinged stuff, in the hopes of like preserving other people's lives, which is unreal.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I also think that his story is probably harder to access for us simply because like he didn't survive the war and he never wrote anything down. So we don't know what his personal feelings were about any of this.
Yeah.
The other two storylines are so full of emotion and character building and changes within those characters, and we don't get that from Basileon, probably for the reason you just mentioned, the fact that we never got to hear it in his words. So I agree. I think his storyline is the least. It doesn't grip you quite as much as the other two do. We do get to see him look for Manny in a way that really breaks my heart, because he doesn't know where Manny is, and then he gets to find him, and oh man, that scene in episode 2 just kills me.
It's brutal.
I think that maybe just one additional thing about John Basileon is that this wasn't his first taste of combat. He had fought on the Philippines. They called him Manila John. And so our other two Marines, we get to see them pretty green. They're figuring out combat for the first time. And John Basileon is going into it with this kind of almost like wariness. Like I think he knows that he's not going to be able to keep all these people safe. And he's just going to, he already kind of knows what he's getting himself into.
Yeah.
The 1st Marine Division, which is Leckie and his friends, they end up being relieved on Guadalcanal. It's December of 1942. And there's this scene where Leckie's talking about how he wrote a poem about their experience on Guadalcanal. And like, it's a lovely poem. It's like an ode to, whatever. It's like quite nice. And then one of his friends is like, that must be a hard poem to write. What the hell rhymes with Guadalcanal? And then Hoosier says, how fucked are we now on Guadalcanal? It's very delightful. Yes, and so they're relieved and they get back on a ship and they find out that their exploits are well known back home. And I think this scene is pretty much lifted straight from Leckie's memoir, where it's like him and Chuckler are talking to this sailor on the boat. And they're like, have you even heard of Guadalcanal? And the sailor's like, well, of course, everybody knows about Guadalcanal. And him and Chuckler both shed a little tear over it because they really thought that they were fighting in the back of Beyond and no one had ever heard of it.
It's a really beautiful scene in the book and in the movie show. You know what? For me, it's a long movie. I just watch it all in one go every time. So I don't even really remember where episodes start or begin.
It's true. Me too. I just binge it. But yeah, the 1st Marine Division, in the 4 months they were on Guadalcanal, they lost 650 killed in action, 1,278 wounded, with a further 8,580 contracting malaria and 31 missing in action. At this point, the Japanese had begun to abandon Guadalcanal. They were pulling back and sort of consolidating their resources elsewhere, and they evacuated the last of their troops in February of 1943.
I just want to quickly address the malaria bit by mentioning a scene from this episode where it's Runner having the runs and also Leckie eating peaches, which earns him his nickname of Peaches. I really like that they managed to make stuff that's really dark, because malaria is no joke, but make it funny in a show that's so incredibly dark.
Yeah, they do a really good job, I think, of balancing like the grittiness and the realness with a levity that is not only necessary for us, but like was very clearly necessary for these guys. You know what I mean? Like you have to laugh or you'll cry, as they all say. So it's very like from Leckie's books that is made very clear in many instances.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, they made jokes so black that like no one outside of that context would think they were funny, but it's how they sort of related to each other and got through it.
Mm-hmm.
At the very end of the episode, we get to watch as Sledge, Eugene, enlists as his heart murmur has disappeared. And he has a conversation with his father, who's a combat surgeon who remembers treating World War I vets. And he says that he's not worried about him getting injured and coming home with like a finger missing, but he's afraid of him coming home with no light in his eyes and no kindness in his heart. And he says that he remembers those World War I soldiers having their souls torn out. And it's this really heartfelt conversation that makes you feel for his parents a lot. Because he's been wanting to go. He's seen it as this huge failure that he's not been able to enlist, and he is embarrassed to not go. And then he's like, give me 5 minutes to break the news to your mother, who's also very sad about it. So
they circle back on it beautifully too at the end when Sledge comes home from the war and like sure enough has horrible nightmares and is having a really hard time readjusting, and his dad is very understanding and kind about it.
His mother is quite impatient with him and she doesn't really understand, but I guess his father, having seen it firsthand in other people, sees it for what it is immediately.
I think that this was like the right choice to make narratively for the show, and I also love the way that book ends, the way that he like is warned, you know, that this is going to have a toll on him. And he not necessarily doesn't really take it seriously, but he just can't understand what that means until he does. But I do think it does the actual Eugene Sledge just a little bit dirty. I don't know if either of y'all read With the Old Breed, but he did have a heart murmur, but that's not why he was late showing up to the war. He went to officer school first because he wanted to be an officer, and he realized it was going to take him too long, so he elected to flunk out of that school and just go as like an enlisted man. I understand why they couldn't fit it in, and I think they made the correct narrative choice for the way that the story needed to develop. But part of me is like, that was such like what a move, you know what I mean? Like that was such a like, hey, I gotta get there. No matter, like, yes, I could make more money or whatever, but like the point for me is not to make the money, it's to get there and help. And like that is something that I wish that they had maybe figured out a way to include, but I get why they didn't at the same time.
I had forgotten about that. It's been such a long time since I've read With the Old Breed, but I also feel like you get the vibe from the Old Breed that Eugene Sledge is like a pretty like logical thinker. It's like this and therefore this. And like he'll talk to you about some of the tactics and strategies and troop movements and stuff. And it's like, it really makes sense to me that he would see the situation he was in and be like, how do I get into the war faster? All right, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
Before we move on to episode 3, it's not even in this episode, it's in episode 1, but can we talk very briefly about the relationship between Sid and Eugene and how rare it is to get to follow characters from before the war together through the war? I mean, we don't get any of it in Band of Brothers, though they could have done it for Skip, Mark, and Piccola. They knew each other before. But I like that we got to follow these two characters from before the war until after the war.
Yeah. Well, and it's such a nice, like, again, not to like be hammering on male intimacy too much or whatever, but like there's a way that masculine friendships are portrayed, especially in war media a lot of times, where they're like sharper edged in a lot of ways. And I really liked that, like this one, because these are young guys, right? Like these are like high school seniors, maybe, you know, and they're just allowed to be like guys who enjoy hanging out together, who are excited to see each other when they're reunited. Like, it's just a really nice take. I also have to commend, this is like a second thought that's interrupting, sorry, but I also do have to commend both of these shows, Band of Brothers and The Pacific, for actually casting actors who are young and who look young and feel young. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it makes a huge difference. And with this friendship in particular, so of course Sid goes to war first, and then there's going to be a scene later where when Eugene finally gets over into the Pacific, him and Sid briefly overlap before Sid gets to go home. And even though they're happy to see each other and they, there's this sort of sense that like Sid is in as much as combat is the great divider, the before and after of a young man's life, like Sid is already in the after. He's been dragged through the meat grinder already. He's been irrevocably changed. And there's like a sense that him and Eugene won't fully recognize each other again until Eugene has been through that too and knows what it's like. Eugene meets up with Sid, and you can tell that Eugene is still kind of the kid from back home, and Sid has become the man that he will be after the war.
Yeah, it's a great scene.
Yeah. Okay, episode 3. It's December of 1942, and I pulled Leckie's quote about Melbourne because I just thought it was really funny. They're relieved on Guadalcanal, they're going to Melbourne, Australia, and they're going to have some time for some R&R. And Leckie talks about how they're rolling up into the harbor, and they're young men, so of course they've got drinking and women and all kinds of stuff on their minds. And he says, "The glory was gone out of it now. Gone was Guadalcanal. Gone was the valor, the doggedness, the willingness to let the jungle pick our whitened bones. We were spent, fit only for the great debauch, stretching gaudily ahead in Melbourne. Say a requiem for camaraderie, mourn the departed fellowship that had bound us, officers and men, from the Carolina coastal march to the last panting lunge over the side of the President Wilson. It was dead." So he's like, fuck it. We all were forgetting Guadalcanal. We were ready to get fucked up.
Yeah, and this is such a long and lush way to say fuck it, we ball. You know what I mean?
Totally. So they're blowing off steam in Australia in the way you would predict. Basilone and his buddy JP are also in Australia, but their celebration is a little bit muted because they've lost their friend Manny. And Basilone does a little bit of his own misbehaving until he finds out that he's going to be awarded the Medal of Honor, and they tell him he has to stop fucking around and set a better example. And we get this storyline where Leckie meets this woman named Stella Caramelis, played by Claire Vanderboom, and he gets to know her family, and they have this whole little relationship. And then she basically breaks up with him because she's like, "You're probably not going to come back, and that's going to break my mother's heart."
Not even mine, just my mother's, but also hers.
This is one of those plot points that, again, I understand why it was made, but the shit that they actually got up to in Melbourne is so much wilder than what they do in the show. It's like almost unbelievable. You know what I mean? Because it was when he says great debauch, he means it. And I understand why they made the changes that they did. And he had in the book, in real life, a very impactful, I think, interaction with an older woman who was like not a romantic prospect, and they did still get that in there. So like I do think that they like honored the spirit of it and stuff, but just truly, if you're a fan of like reading at all, if you read nothing else, read Leckie's book, because it's fucking crazy. Not only am I amazed that they survived the war, I truly don't know how all of them survived Melbourne, you know. Like,
no, it's true, because even to the next point that we have here, there's a bit where Leckie and Chuckler end up in the brig because Chuckler's supposed to be standing guard and he's hammered. And then he's like, "I gotta go take a piss." And Leckie is also hammered. And he's like, "I'll watch your spot for you." And then their CO shows up and Leckie like pulls a gun on him. This did happen effectively in real life, but Leckie had the consequence in the show is that Leckie gets transferred to an intelligence unit, like away from his friends. But like in the book, that transfer happens before the situation where him and Chuckler get hammered and fuck up, because his company was known for being so full of like shitheads and fuck ups that like a whole bunch of them got transferred out because the CO was like, "I am not dealing with this anymore." It was like moving, like if you have two little boys in a class who are talking and kibitzing all the time, like you move them apart from each other so that they stop being so irritating for everyone to deal with.
Happened to me more than once.
I feel like you need to tell us, because I have read this book, but I honestly cannot remember what they get up to in Melbourne.
Okay. So I don't remember every specific, even though I have read it many times, but I do remember that more than once they were in bars where the local police had to come and get them out because everyone was being so rowdy. And so it was like local police and MPs, and they would flee from the MPs, and they were like climbing buildings to try to get away from them, which is how he met this woman who is this 50-year-old woman living in Melbourne. I can't remember what her exact backstory was, but she was familiar with soldiers or with enlisted men in some capacity. So when she saw them running away, she was like, come inside. Like, you can hide out here. And that's how they met this woman. And I think he went back to her house at least once to get away from MPs as well. And I do distinctly recall somebody having to sneak back onto a boat at some point for reasons I cannot remember. They had like snuck out when they weren't supposed to be there, and they had to get on the boat. And I'm pretty sure it involved them either getting in the water or almost falling into the water at one point. And then all the stuff with him pulling a gun on a CO happened. There were a couple fights as well. They just really let loose in a way that was delightful to me to read, because I've never been arrested for anything, but I've done a lot of things that I probably could have been arrested for if I hadn't had the good sense to exit scenes when I did. So I really related to that experience of being like, oh, this sounds like something I would have done at a time in my life. When I was like around that same age, I was getting up to similar trouble. So it was I never pulled a gun on anybody, but I definitely did steal some things and sneak into some places where I should not have been. So
yeah. And the unfortunate thing is that I think a lot of people find this episode to be the most boring one. And a lot of people don't like the Stella plotline. And the Stella plotline really grew on me. Like, I do like her as a character, and I like the whole thing with her family and how Leckie finds a home with her parents in the way he doesn't have with his own. But I do think that once I had read the memoir, I was like, they really could have spiced up this episode. It really could have been a little bit more fun.
Yeah, he did meet a woman in Melbourne, but it wasn't quite as intense as it's like portrayed in the show. I think the same thing happened to R.V. Bergen, if I'm remembering correctly, but he did wind up later engaged to that woman, but he met someone there who was going to break up with him which that's one thing they do in this show that I really don't like. They attribute certain characters things to other characters, and they do it because they just don't have enough room, to let everyone be on stage or on screen as much as they probably would have liked. But I don't think we'll meet him on this episode. But when we meet Snafu, I think he got shafted in a lot of ways, because a lot of the stuff that is attributed to his character is stuff from Leckie's book that other people are doing. Anyway, that was a tangent.
No, I agree. There's definitely quite a lot of that happens, which, I mean, if you haven't read the books, it's not going to bother you. So
yeah, you'll just be like, it's crazy that he's doing that. And you're like, well, he wasn't, but somebody was, and it was important for them to show it. So I get why they made that choice. Anyway.
Right.
But yeah, Melbourne has grown on me as an episode too. I was really against the Stella plotline at first, just because I was like, why do we have to put a romance in everything? But I love the relationship that he has with her mother. And I do think it's so beautiful and like poignant. And Stella herself is like, it's fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with that relationship. I was just like, that's not how it really went.
I know. There's a couple of sex scenes that they have, and to me, I'm just not really interested. But I understand that perhaps I'm not always the target demographic for a war show, and that probably people who watched it were like, yeah, sex scene.
Yeah.
I do like the scene they put in there where they go to is it a wake that they go to when one of the neighboring family's son has died overseas?
Yeah.
And Leckie joins her, and it kind of, again, gives you a little glimpse into his character. And that's a nice addition, I think.
Yeah, I like that part too. I've come around on it in the end, I guess. But right after reading the book, I was like, why? Why this? But now, like, from the narrative perspective, again, I do think they made a lot of correct calls in many ways by kind of truncating or adjusting.
Yeah. And it is nice to see them make an effort to include some women who have personalities and dialogue in a way that was not super present in Band of Brothers.
Yes, very true.
Is this also the episode? Again, if I'm wrong and it's in episode 4, then I apologize. But does Sid need his girlfriend in this episode? Yeah.
Yes, he does.
He becomes, in the other sense of the word, a man in this episode. And he talks about it to Eugene in the next episode, which is just really sort of boyish and cute.
Yeah. And you're just kind of like, wow, this man has literally killed people, and he's like stoked to lose his virginity. Like, that's the whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do like Sydney's character so much. Like, I don't think at the beginning I was quite so stoked, but I really like seeing a good friendship in a show. You don't get a whole lot of those.
Sid is interesting for me because from my perspective, he is the only character we are shown in this show that has like regular screen time that makes it through to the other end and is happy and settled. Again, I think the show does a really good example of showing like multiple facets of the experience. And I love that he's not unaffected and he's not unchanged, but he comes through it and finds ballast in ways that some of the other characters don't.
Yeah, and there is a great scene at the end where Eugene is kind of like, what are we supposed to do? And Sid, who notably has been home for like 2 years at this point, but also is 21, maybe 22, and has already been through the worst thing that's ever going to happen to him. And he's kind of like, well, you just get up every day and it gets a little easier, and sooner or later you start to forget some things. And then it's like, wow, there's like none of these people have access to therapy. It's just like whatever wisdom this 21-year-old has to impart on his equally young friend from what he's learned over the past couple of years, like that's what he's doing.
Yeah.
Yep. At the end of the episode, Sam's already mentioned it, but John Besselon gets awarded the Medal of Honor. He's still drunk, I think, when he gets awarded it. After that, because he's such a hero, he gets to go home to the US and he goes on a war bonds tour. And I don't like this part of the storyline anymore. So
yeah, for the uninitiated, they take, this like quote unquote war hero guy who's known for these exploits, and they basically send him on this tour, this whistle stop tour all around the US with this like gorgeous celebrity on his arm. And he's going around being like, I'm a war hero, buy war bonds. And they literally raised like billions of dollars in this way. Like, you really can't underestimate how successful it was as like a strategy to raise money for the US military. But he notably does not want to do this. Like, he wants to stay and fight, but they're sending him on this trip.
Anyone who has seen the first Captain America movie, I think that experience, because it's kind of the same thing that happens, I think it is like in some way inspired by this kind of, I don't know if the folks who made the Captain America movie are big, Pacific heads, but if not, there are a stunning number of similarities between the way that the Steve Rogers character feels about the war bond tour that he's made to go on versus the way that John Basselone is portrayed as feeling in the Pacific, that I think are very interesting.
Yeah, and we talked about this in our Flags of Our Fathers episode too, because they also sent the men who had quote unquote raised the flag on Iwo Jima, they sent on a war bonds tour. And so that movie is also full of men who really don't feel like heroes, and they are really uncomfortable with the spotlight, but they're being put in this position where they have to keep talking about what they've done in order to get people to effectively give money to the war effort.
So go listen to that episode, and also go listen to our episode about Captain America, because it's on there too.
Yeah, it is also like a really vivid look at the early stages of the American advertising machine. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure.
I just love this stupid show.
Hell yeah.
I think I'm going to go watch it after this, because it's been like probably a year or two since I last like watched the whole thing through. Like, I still will pick up an episode here and there if I'm like feeling particularly squirrely, but like, man, I should watch that again. I miss those guys.
Oh yeah, I binged it last week, like in over 2 nights kind of thing. I was house sitting for my friend and just sitting there like cuddling with her dog, watching my favorite war show.
Hell yes. Love that.
Should we, for fun, just do 3 ratings for each of our episodes so we can ask Beck to rate it?
All right. How many regurgitated peaches out of 10 would you rate the first 3 episodes of The Pacific?
If we're going as a collection, like as a unit, my rating would be different. I think overall, I would give these episodes as a trio, I'm going to say like a 7.5, only because episode 3 is maybe my least favorite in terms of like the whole series, but that is because I'm being absolutely biased by the fact that I know what really happened on Melbourne. And I think that there are some episodes later. Basically, the Pacific for me is like once the train gets rolling, the whole latter half of the show, I think, is just knockout after knockout of episodes. So the beginning episodes for me are good, but I do think the later episodes are better. So I'm going to say 7.5 as a trio. 7.5 regurgitated peaches.
What would you rate the show if you were to rate the show as a whole?
As a whole, I would probably rate it, for me personally, like a high 8, maybe even a 9, just because I do think it has some issues. I mean, Poe Buddy's nerfed and all, but of the vast majority of war media that I have consumed, it is probably my favorite. I think it does the best at humanizing not only the soldiers on the American side, but the soldiers on the Japanese side. I think that the characters are the most interesting. I liked them enough that I went and sought out, their memoirs and learned more about them and stuff, which I don't always do usually, but like some memoirs I'm like, cool, I read that, and this one I'm like, oh, this became my favorite book, you know what I mean? Like, so it just has a special place in my heart personally.
Yeah, I liked With the Old Breed, but Helmet for My Pillow is my favorite war memoir. It's so good. It's just, I definitely recommend it. I also listened to the audiobook as narrated by James Badge-Dale.
James Badge-Dale.
Show. And it's lovely. Like sometimes I just throw that audiobook on and I just love to listen to like the sound of his voice because he's just so perfectly cast as Leckie.
It's extremely good. I also will recommend, so With the Old Breed is good, but I actually enjoyed even more Sledge's other book, China Marine, which is about his occupation duty in China after the war was over because he was there for a while. And that was, I have read so few accounts of that particular role in World War II. It was so interesting.
I've heard people talk about that one too, and I'm curious. I got to check it out. We've read some other Leckie books. I enjoyed Turning Point in the Pacific, which is his book about Guadalcanal specifically. And it's not from his perspective. It's like a history book. And he also wrote Strongmen Armed the United States Marines versus Japan, which is about broadly what the Marines were doing, because Leckie served in every major campaign that the 1st Marine Division was involved in, except Okinawa, because he had been wounded before that. And so this book covers like basically all the things the Marines were doing in the Pacific from start to end of the war. And it's super interesting and really well written.
Yeah. I like him as a historian too, because he started as a journalist. So he has, this like sort of journalistic ethical take to a lot of his work, which I find makes for not only a compelling, but a very like honest view of a lot of the stuff that he was involved in.
Yeah, for sure.
And then if anyone wants a non-World War II, but still war book recommendation, I work as a tour guide. So I talk a lot about like the American Revolution because the area that I live in was established just before that. And so I started reading this book specifically about the American Revolution that's part of the Oxford collection, the Oxford History of the United States. And it's The Glorious Cause by Robert Middlecoff. It's so interesting. And he does such a great job of like explaining not only what like the revolution, it's the American Revolution itself, but like why it happened, what was contextually going on in politics and culture at the time. It's very interesting and very good. So if you're looking for, I've got the audiobook and the physical book, and they're both great.
Amazing.
First of all, Beck, thank you so much for being on with us again. It was really fun as usual.
Thank you. It was a blast from my end too.
Welcome back anytime. And thank you everybody else for listening to another episode of Rosie. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and you can rate us 5 stars. We would really like it if you did. You can follow us on Instagram at Rosie the Reviewer Podcast. You can send this episode to a friend who needs to read more Bob Leckie books. And if you want to read more about these books, you can visit our website, rosieTheReviewer.com. See you next week.
Bye.
Bye.